Hello, everyone. Good morning or midday. Welcome to today's lunch webinar by the Agricola School and the Illicit Trade Group. Today, Alex will talk about the blurring of lines between politicians and civil servants in the Netherlands. So without further ado, Alex, the floor is yours and you can start presenting.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mira. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in, taking a precious hour from your lunch break to come and hear me talk about politics the day after elections. So I imagine you're all done and fed up of politics. So I appreciate your presence, everyone here. I see some familiar faces. So hi to my colleagues in Leeuwarden who have tuned in. As Mira mentioned, my name is Alex Belloir. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at Campus Friesland in Leeuwarden, so the youngest of the faculties here at the Rijksuniversiteit Groningen. I'm fairly new to the Illicit Trade Group, having more or less reached out to the group at the end of last year, to which I was offered the opportunity to present to you here today. So many thanks to the Illicit Trade Group and also to the Agricola School for hosting today. So without further ado, enough about me. Today I'm going to be talking more broadly about bureaucratic politicization and its consequences and what that means on policy and decision making here within the Netherlands. I decided to split this into two distinct parts. So the first one will be more generally about defining what is bureaucratic politicization, what does it look like, what are its different forms, and also provide some examples to make it a little bit more relatable. And the second part, which is with the break here in my contents list, I'll talk about the latest research that I've been done and the chapter that I just finished a couple of weeks ago for a handbook, which is more specifically orientated towards the Netherlands and hence gives a little bit more insights on the second part of this presentation, which is the consequences of bureaucratic politicization and the influence it has on policymaking. So that's essentially the layout of today's lecture. I'll jump in straight away. So essentially to talk about bureaucratic politicization, before I get into definitions, it's important to know that we first need to accept that democratic systems are essentially composed of two distinct sides. So on the one side, we have the political side, whilst on the other side, we have the more administrative side. This is, of course, not a new idea. This is anchored in the classics in public administration and political science scholarship. All of them, as you can see here, by the dates dating to approximately the turn of the 20th century. And there are primarily three core scholars who essentially talk about this distinction or started to talk about a distinction necessary between politicians and bureaucrats. So the first here, they're just in chronological order, not in order of importance or anything, was Woodrow Wilson, who was the 28th president of the United States. And in 1887, he wrote a book entitled The Study of Administration, where he essentially stated that to function, democracies need an administrative apparatus that is not the product of a spoil system defined by nepotism, patronage, and clientelism. For a little bit of context, in the United States at that time, when it came to presidential elections, it wasn't uncommon if you were running for election to essentially promise your supporters, so those who gave you financial donations, for example, to remunerate them if you were elected with a position within the civil service, so appointing them specific positions within the government. And Wilson saw this as a huge problem when it came to implementing policies because he realized there was no expertise and there was therefore problems when it came to actually implementing these policies, as you had these ideologues in positions where things should be within the institution that should be implementing policies. So essentially Woodrow's first seminal piece essentially provides the idea that the bureaucracy should be independent from politicians and government. And this ties in very closely to what Goodnow, also an American scholar, I believe he was the first ever administrative law professor at Johns Hopkins University. And essentially, about, when was it, 6 years later, he essentially said the functions of the state are naturally divided into the expression of the public will, so politics, and the execution of that will, so administration. And essentially what he was saying here was that democracies have an ideological side and an implementation side, so they're inherently different. So whilst Woodrow said bureaucracy should be independent, Goodenow basically built upon that and said there are two sides to governance, the ideologues and those who enforce or basically roll out these policies. Thirdly, we have a European scholar, Max Weber, known for many, many things, so I don't think I need to introduce him all too much. But essentially, he was perhaps one of the greatest thinkers about modern bureaucracy that we have in Europe, where he basically said that a strong distinction between administrative and political roles are necessary. And essentially, he defined 6 criteria for bureaucrats, 4 of which were essentially expertise, rule-based decision-making, that they be rational thinkers, and specialization, so that they were specialized in their policy domains. In this sense, they kind of draw a line between the criteria of what bureaucrats should have. So if we take these 3 core scholars together, we can see that they form the heart of our modern democratic systems that we have today. So we essentially have politics on one side, bureaucrats on the other, and in that sense, we have the representatives of the people who are elected, and we have those that implement these elected and chosen policies. And this is what we call, in the jargon, the politics-administrative dichotomy. And this has given birth to all different streams within public administration research, political research, such as researching what we call PARs, political administrative relations, from the 80s, etc. But the core idea here is to think about that there's a core distinction within democratic systems between politicians and civil servants. This almost seems a little bit obvious, a little bit, that doesn't really need to be explained or anything, but it's important here because it raises the question, so when do civil servants who work for politicians and with politicians, when do they become too political? And when do they stray too close to political waters? If there's a distinction between the two, but they both work in close proximity in the political realm, how can we draw this line? Where's the boundary between the two? And this is what we call, when civil servants step more closer towards politics, this is what we call bureaucratic politicization. Here you can see Cooper in 2021 provided perhaps the broadest of all definitions that are out there, which was essentially, quote unquote, any intrusion of politics into administration. So as we can see with this, it's extremely broad. What does any encompass? Well, it encompasses anything. But I think that the key word to take into account here is the word intrusion, which alludes to the fact that it is elements that should not be within bureaucracies that are coming into this realm. So in this essence, politicization, is when politics sort of encroaches and impedes and intrudes into the bureaucratic arena. Thankfully, we have an array of theories out there to kind of help us make sense of this very broad and very vague notion of bureaucratic politicization. And you can distinguish within the literature on bureaucratic politicization essentially 3 forms, 3 streams, or 3 schools of thought about approaching bureaucratic politicization and going about identifying it and studying it. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of each one of them, since it's more the theoretical framework behind bureaucratic politicization. But the first one here on the left is what we call formal politicization. Simply put, this refers to the formal positions within the civil service becoming politicized. So think about, for example, Woodrow Wilson's example that I provided earlier in the introduction. You have a certain position within the bureaucracy which gets appointed with someone who has a political affinity. This is what we would call formal politicization. So rather than filling that position with an expert-based specialist, it is filled with a political actor instead. Research on this tends to hence look at political control over formal positions and looks at certain elements such as recruitment or appointment, remuneration, so how are these civil servants or civil servants in these positions remunerated, and termination, so positions in which there's an individual within it, why are they fired, for example, and someone else ends up coming in. This is by far the oldest, or perhaps the first type of politicization that was out there in the research of bureaucratic politicization. It's been around since approximately the early 70s, and most of the papers that you'll see will be focusing on this form of bureaucratic politicization. And we see especially a focus on post-Soviet countries, so what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, etc., etc. However, we see that it seems to be that today it's no longer the most common form of politicization that we see within Western democracies. This brings us to the second form, functional politicization, which essentially refers to looking at how the functions of the civil service are being politicized. So what do we mean here by functions? To put it simply, their tasks, their duties, their behavior. So in what way are civil servants behaving in more political manners, to put it simply, on which way are they being asked to do tasks which are more political than in the purview of that profession. We can see that a lot of research hence looks at political control over civil service behavior and the conduct of civil servants, with a focus on indicators such as self-censorship. So when do civil servants decide to not say what they think they should be saying, but what seems more politically agreeable to the politician in question? Hyper-responsiveness, so how fast do they react to a politician's request or demands, which isn't necessarily a good thing, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, sorry, and also doesn't always indicate politicization, but it kind of is an element that some scholars have focused on to kind of see if there's politicization within that field. Another one is aligning with ministers' interests. That's fairly explanatory, although, as we said, everything in politicization research is a bit of a grey line. When is it politicized? When is it not? But this is what we see with functional. It's more and more looking at behavior, and this is more and more the focus of research since it kind of emerged in the mid-90s to the beginning of the 2000s. So we see more and more articles are focusing on functional politicization, although the bulk really does focus on formal. Finally, we have administrative politicization, which is by far the newest form of politicization to have appeared within the literature. Essentially, if we look at relations between politicians and civil servants, we can see there's a third actor within this little relationship, which is essentially what we'll call the political advisor, or more formally known as a special advisor. And this is essentially a political helper for a minister. A good example would be in the United Kingdom with Boris Johnson. You had Dominic Cummings, who was very unpopular, we could say. And with Mark Rutte, I think there was a debate in 2019 where he had a blackout, and there was this famous headline where Mark Rutte was calling out for Caroline. So Caroline is Mark Rutte's political advisor. And essentially, what administrative politicization looks at is how these advisors themselves impact civil services jobs of providing impartial and evidence-based advice. And essentially, they say that this is done in one of two ways, either by the political advisor acting as a barrier towards this political advice, so in the sense of civil servants feel that they cannot access the minister because the political assistant is the one who shows up to the meetings rather than the minister, and hence they have to add a political twist if they want their advice to be put up the line and given to the minister. The second way is that they see more and more that the political political assistants themselves essentially politicize the advice that is given to them themselves. So they add a political spin to the recommendations, or they kind of push civil servants, and this is more frequently the case, to add some more political dimensions. So essentially it's kind of a low-key, indirect form of blackmail, where they say, okay, if you want this to be bought by the minister, if you want them to take us on board, take into account these political aspects so that it's more sellable for the minister, to the cabinet, and to his peers. This is essentially the third form of bureaucratic politicization, which is far newer than the others, as it surfaced only in 2008 from two scholars in New Zealand, Chris Eichbaum and Richard Shaw. And we see this is definitely an expansion over the recent years, being only about 15 years old, but it's definitely not the main focus of research at the moment. However, it could be becoming more and more popular in the Netherlands, as since April of last year, April of 2022, we saw that the Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, signed basically an agreement which allowed all ministers to now have two political assistants instead of one. So there's questions now about what this means for politicization or administrative politicization in the Netherlands, if anything. So that's essentially the three forms and the background. Perhaps it's interesting to give some examples of what this looks like to make it a little bit more relatable. I take the example of the United Kingdom. Although Brexit and the Tories and their rise to power has been a terrible thing for many, many people in many different ways, it's been fantastic for my research and has been great for giving me examples of bureaucratic politicization in practice. So that's one of the benefits that I can see for myself, at least. But if we take the case of Boris Johnson whilst he was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, here are a few examples from 2020-2021 period, so in a short time frame, of some politicization that took place there. So for example, when it comes to formal politicization, in 2020, Boris Johnson went to appoint a new first civil service commissioner, so essentially the individual who is in charge of selecting the senior civil servants for the British bureaucratic apparatus. Usually this is an apolitical appointment, so based on a specialist who knows the civil service very well and knows all about the criteria that are needed. But controversially, what Boris Johnson did was he appointed Gisela Stewart, who was actually a key Brexit campaigner, and this caused a lot of outrage within the United Kingdom, where people started to say, "Why are we appointing a political individual, especially someone who aligns so closely with the goals that were trying to be achieved at that time, to this civil service position?" A second example was also, I'm sure many of you have heard, during COVID, the United Kingdom was on lockdown, as with many other countries. Social gatherings were not allowed to take place. And what we saw happening was the Partygate scandal, which was whilst everyone was staying at home and not allowed to socialize in groups larger than their immediate family or in very, very small groups, we saw that there was, within Westminster, within the Prime Minister's office, there were a lot of parties going on and gatherings, informal ones with drinks, cakes, etc., etc. And this led to the Partygate scandal, where people were calling out saying it's unfair that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet and that Westminster in general makes these rules and puts on legal sanctions on people who break these rules, whilst they themselves don't respect these rules. And after public outcry, this led to an investigation being requested by the people, which Boris Johnson and his cabinet decided to do internally. So they accepted, they saw it as a legitimate thing to do. However, they ended up appointing to the head of this investigation Simon Case. And Simon Case is a senior civil servant, so technically a political position, but it turns out that he was also part of most of these parties, which leads a lot of questions as to what would the results have been of this, this internal investigation when you end up appointing someone in a formal position who has these political affinities in the sense that they were also at this party. So thankfully it kind of got cut short before it came to fruition, and it wasn't where Partygate ended. But those are two examples of formal politicization within the United Kingdom. Briefly on functional politicization, we also saw that within the Ministry of Trade, there was their press office, which started to essentially lie about some events that took place, just simply to cover the minister's tracks. So I can't remember, unfortunately, exactly what this scandal or what this information was about, but essentially the core thing here for politicization was that there was information about the minister. It seemed to paint him or her in a unfavorable light. So what the civil servants did working in the Ministry of Trade's press office did was they decided to kind of lie about the facts to make it a bit more political favorable for the minister in question. Finally, we see with administrative politicization, so as I mentioned, this is when political assistants play a role within politicization, the bureaucracy. We had Dominic Cummings, who was perhaps the most famous of all political assistants in United Kingdom history, mainly due to his unpopularity and how he was very much in the forefront of the media headlines, the tabloid headlines, should I say, more particularly during the time he worked for Boris Johnson. And essentially, they were discussing, Boris Johnson was discussing reforming the civil service at the time because there were claims that it was not political enough. And what happened was that these calls to reform came from Dominic Cummings himself, basically saying to Boris Johnson, listen, things aren't going well, the civil service. If you want to get policy through, if you want your agenda through, you need to reform the civil service so it's more politically aligned with your personal views. That didn't really go through, at least thankfully, not as far as to the extent as Dominic Cummings and perhaps Boris Johnson would have wanted, mainly because of other scandals in which Dominic Cummings left office or was fired, actually, soon after. So, yeah, I won't go into further details about scandals within UK context during that period because I might need an extra hour. But anyway, the main message here is basically to give you some illustrations of what different forms of politicization look like in practice. This essentially brings me to the second part of what I wanted to discuss today, which is essentially we now know what is bureaucratic politicization, its various forms, and how it looks. So now we're going to look at basically the consequences thereof. And to do so, we are going to look at the most recent paper that I wrote, which is a chapter for a handbook on coordination within the core executive, decision-making in international organizations and the EU. It's forthcoming, so accepted for publication, should be printed later in 2023. But essentially what I did with my supervisor, Casper van den Berg, we decided to look within this chapter at the Dutch executive coordination landscape and transformations within. That's a mouthful, it's a lot of jargon, it probably doesn't mean much hearing it that way. So what exactly do we mean here when we say we're looking at executive coordination within the Netherlands? Well, essentially we can break this into two parts. The executive means essentially, or the core executive, that we are looking at all the individuals within Dutch government who are responsible for policy and decision making related to policy. So think of ministers, state secretaries, senior civil servants, political advisors, etc., etc. So essentially the executive, or the core executive in this case, is that group of people who sit at the very summit of national government. On the second hand, we have coordination. So here I've just stolen Hood and Margaret's quote, which essentially states that coordination is a tool of government to ensure that the different elements are organized in such a manner that they work together effectively. Essentially, what does this mean? It means that we are looking how these elements within the core executive, they are organized so that they work smoothly. Taken together with these two elements, what exactly was this paper or this chapter that I was working on looking at? Well, essentially the focus was upon how is national decision-making and policy-making done in the Netherlands, and how has it changed over recent years and why. So that was essentially the idea here. To go about this, we conducted interviews with senior civil servants within the Netherlands, basically at the highest position, so Secretary General, and also Director General, so that's in the second and third positions of the most senior levels. Did a number of interviews in a number of ministries, different departments, etc., over a long period of time. And we also, thankfully, just at the beginning of this year, were able to get an interview with the Secretary General for the Prime Minister's Office, so the Ministry of General Affairs, who essentially is the highest senior servant working for the Prime Minister himself. So that gave us some very valuable insights upon how things are developing within the Netherlands when it comes to core executive decision making and how policy is made now in the Netherlands. To make this a little bit easier, break it down into essentially transformations. We'll first explain how policymaking usually works in the Netherlands very briefly, but essentially in the Dutch system, it's a very the Dutch system is composed of multiple elements, multiple parts. For example, it's a consensus democracy with proportional representation and hence coalition governments, which basically means, in simple words, that when it comes to the Dutch form of governments, we have a lot of opinions, we have a lot of different political parties, or in essence, we have a lot of cogs in the wheel when it comes to making policy and making sure that the policy-making process comes to fruition. So coordination is vital, since there's so many elements within the Dutch governmental structure. So how is policy-making and decision-making made? Well, very simply, if we look here to this chart, if we start all the way on the left, there is the minister who is responsible for a certain department, so such as the Minister of Health, who decides to draft a bill upon a certain topic. He will ask within his ministry to concerned departments to draft a bill. So the senior civil servants within this department will, based on the knowledge and expertise they can gather, draft a proposal for this policy, which will then, once finished, be sent to an entry committee or an ambtelijk voorportaal, which is essentially a group of senior civil servants who will go over it, who are specialized in this domain, who will go over it to check mostly for legislatively whether it holds water and there are not any issues with this proposal. This will then move on to standing committee. There are two types, but I won't go into the differences because it's beyond the scope of today. But essentially, these are composition, a committee of ministers, senior civil servants also, and advisors, etc., who basically will take this policy proposal, glance over it, and basically, based upon it, will then prepare a recommendation of what they think should happen for this policy issue, for this issue that arose, before passing it on to the cabinet. And the cabinet, which is essentially the summit of Dutch government, which is ruled by the prime minister and all the other composite ministers, they will be the ones responsible for making a decision. So, in essence, what do we see here? We can see that the core executive, basically within the Netherlands, if we were to draw a line before Parliament, is this whole group here, from ministerial department to the cabinet, composed of all the different individuals within. And below here we see the Prime Minister's office. That's essentially the office of the Prime Minister, which basically keeps an eye on the process all the way throughout to make sure that policy aligns and sticks to what was mentioned within the coalition agreement and what they said to the public, so that the policy matches what they promised, more or less. This is how policy should work in the Netherlands. Very structured, intricate process from an idea, a policy proposal, to sending it to Parliament. But we see that, unfortunately, over the past 15 years, there have been three developments within this policy-making landscape that have come within executive coordination and decision-making. And essentially, the three of them, we see there's an increased number of informal meetings, there's an increased number of cabinet members, and in particular ministers, and also there's more interdepartmental collaboration. So I'll expand upon each of them one by one to make this a little bit more relatable. But when it comes to an increased number of informal meetings, as I mentioned here on the previous slide, usually these are the formal meetings which take place when it comes to making a policy decision, pretty much within the executive, within national government. What we see, though, however, is that over recent years, over past 15 years, as stated by multiple media articles, but also from insights from our interviews from 2019 with senior civil servants, we can see that they will say that there are more and more informal meetings taking place with key members within the executive. So think of ministers and the prime minister, etc., etc. Formal meetings aren't necessarily a bad thing, because if you're in charge to make a policy or draw it up, of course you want to have some informal meetings with your colleagues to think about what is the best way about going something. But what we see here is when these informal meetings that they are talking about in particular are with these core actors such as ministers, prime minister, etc., etc. And the core difference is that these meetings serve to basically pre-decide upon decisions. So whereas within each of these structures here, these are where decisions should be made or what should be discussed as to recommendations, we can see that these actually pre-decisions or decisions are made outside of the formal channels. A good example of this, which was highly criticized in the Netherlands, was what they called the Monday Coalition Council meeting, or the coalitieoverleg, which was essentially a meeting between the Prime Minister and all the heads of the coalition parties. and also the vice prime ministers, who essentially gathered every Monday morning to basically make sure that everyone was on the same boat and to all decide what they were going to do on different decisions throughout the week, so that before these official meetings came and they could be discussed with all included members, they'd already taken a stance and decided what they were going to do. So this basically posed a lot of issues when it came to transparency and to who actually held power, because decisions were being made by individuals, not all of the individuals, outside of these formal fora, pretty much. Coalition Council meeting came under huge scrutiny and was actually scrapped at the end of the Rutte 4 government, so it no longer formally exists. However, there are a number of these other meetings which are a lot less, structural, so they don't take place every Monday morning as this one did, but we can see there are more and more of these meetings that surface more ad hoc, also involving key players within decision making that surface more and more. So this is something that civil servants are worried about, and that the Prime Minister and the government have been called out upon, saying decisions should be made in these formal forums, so none of these informal ones. But we see that despite the scrutiny of 2017, this is still a big issue, and it's still happening more and more. So essentially, an increased number of informal meetings. Important to realize here is that these are informal meetings where decisions are pre-decided upon outside of the official channels. Secondly, we see that there are more and more ministers within cabinet. This means that essentially when you have a cabinet with more and more ministers, what does this mean? Well, it means that decision-making when it comes to policy requires the agreement of more parties, which means that there are more political dimensions that need to be taken into account. So if you have a small cabinet with, say, for example, 10 members, you only have to have 10 people on board, compared to if you have 20 individuals, you have to have 20 on board. And when there's more individuals, when there's more people, that means there's more diverging opinions, which means that, in essence, you need to ensure that the policy is agreeable to all of them. We'll get into the details of that a bit later on when I come to discussing, when I bring it back to functional politicization. But what we can see is that in the Netherlands, when Mark Rutte took cabinet for his first term in office in 2010, he scaled back the cabinet to the smallest cabinet that they ever had, which was just 12 ministers. And today it's at I think it's either the highest or the top 3 largest cabinets they've ever had, with 20 ministers currently. So essentially the message to remember here is that when you have more people in cabinet, it makes coordination more challenging, as you need to have more people on board. So that's the second development that civil servants have noticed over the period of the past 10 years. Cabinets are getting larger. The third one is we can see that there's more and more interdepartmental collaboration. Now this is particularly relevant for here on the left in the ministerial department, so all the way to the left here on the slide. And essentially what we see is that within this first layer of decision making, so when they start to draft a policy proposal, the policy issues back in the past could be done with just the department in question, or maximum with the help of a second department. Now what civil servants are seeing is that almost every single piece of policy that has to be drafted requires the help or the involvement of multiple parties, and this is what we talk about here with interdepartmental collaboration. And there's 2 hypotheses as to why this is the case. The first is simply because, well, the policy issues at hand are more complex than ever. So thinking about global warming, reducing CO2 emissions, etc. If you to just focus that in the Ministry of Ecology, it's not going to work, because these are issues that impact society as a whole. So in that regards, there is more and more interdepartmental collaboration because the issues themselves are more complex. Or the second hypothesis is because it's a political choice. And in that sense, what we could see is that because there is larger cabinets, etc., more political parties involved, that civil servants feel that they have to then involve all different dimensions as to ensure that it makes a policy which touches upon different elements. What this results in is basically policy formations which are less streamlined and slower, simply because they require more individuals. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it means you have more experts thinking about it, but it does mean that technically policy formation or these proposals take longer to come to fruition. So these are 3 developments that we've seen. what does this essentially, why is this the case? I'm aware of the time, so I'll speed it up a little bit. Essentially, we see it's because of political party fragmentation. So we can see that over recent years, the political landscape is becoming more and more unstable. These are drafts that I made with the geodienst here at the university about to kind of illustrate how more fragmented the political landscape is becoming in the Netherlands over recent years. So we can see in 2006 a fairly centralized bubble, although quite wide. And as we go through the years, we can see that things have become more and more hectic, more fragmented, and coalitions encompass a broader spectrum of political parties and hence political ideologies. I apologize for the last one. I had to throw it together. The geodienst didn't have time, or I didn't contact them early enough to get them to make a nicer one. But this is the one from the 2021 election results of the current cabinet we have here. But essentially what these graphics do is they illustrate nicely how more unstable or how more fragmented in ideology and in the number of parties coalition or the Dutch cabinet, the decision maker basically, is nowadays. And this is why we can explain that we have these three developments, according to senior civil servants that we interviewed, that these three developments came about. What does this essentially mean? Well, essentially means that when we take this fragmentation that's led to these three developments, it means that today the impact on policymaking in the Netherlands is one in which the Prime Minister is more central to everything, and also in which senior civil servants are under more political pressure. Seeing the time, I won't delve into the first one, but if you have questions or you're interested in what that means, I'd be more than happy to elaborate in the questions. But here we'll focus on the second one, which is that because of this fragmentation and hence because of these developments, we see that the civil service is under more and more political pressure. And what does that mean? Well, essentially, because there's more turbulence in the political landscape, there's more pressure placed upon civil servants to get policy, to make policy that will be accepted by the coalition, first of all, but also by Parliament afterwards. And this means that essentially ministers or politicians are asking for political advice from these senior civil servants to be political, to get some political arguments or recommendations alongside the expertise-based, advice that they're giving. Essentially, what does this mean? Civil servants, senior civil servants, have to think about the political angles and about politics whilst they're drawing up policy, which shouldn't be the case. In essence, and to come to what we came here for, what are the consequences of senior civil servants having to act more politically? Well, essentially, we see that there are four main consequences within the Netherlands. First of all, we see that acting more politically, senior civil servants having to act more politically, results in changes to the very fabric of the senior civil servant profession. So first of all, we can see that civil servants have to think more and more about political dimensions rather than expertise, which means that the professionalization or the quality of the civil service is kind of going downhill. And in another paper that I published in 2021, I took survey data from civil servants from around the Netherlands, which was done at 3 points in time. And essentially they said, as we can see in evolution over time, that they saw that political astuteness was now the main criteria for their job rather than substantive expertise. This is a worrying development because we can see that the expert-based knowledge of the civil service is kind of moving to a more political one, which means it's really deteriorating the fact-based and the expertise that we have within the civil service. Also within the fabric of the civil service, we see that means that there will no longer be a apolitical challenger to politicians when it comes to policy. So essentially, if you have a purely evidence and fact-based civil service, when it comes to policy making, they can essentially say, hey, that's a political idea. That's not the best way to go about things based on the facts and the evidence. So essentially, this is how we recommend things should be done. If you only have a politicized civil service that is providing evidence with this political aspect, that means that kind of deteriorates in a way, and there's no more what we call speaking truth to power. A second big consequence, and I'll rush through these now because I'm aware of the time, is that we can see that the focus on political aspects means there's less time for substantive aspects to making policy. So in essence, there is less and less time and less manpower within the civil service and less expertise to focus upon financial or legal aspects of a policy proposal. So you can see that the quality of the proposal or of this policy and hence goes down. We'll see the policy-making cycles are longer because politics has to be included. There's more back and forth. The cycles hence last longer. And once again, there's less time for more policy to come in and to be deliberated, and it slows down the policy-making process in general. Finally, we can see a number of issues regarding continuity, so meaning that there's issues further down the line. In essence, we can see that the civil service is hence drained of basically its organizational knowledge and memory of how to deal with policy issues when they surface. But also we can see that it means that further down the line, when senior civil servants are giving a policy which has already been implemented to build upon or to edit or whatever it is, they're getting a policy which was based in political reality at the time rather than evidence-based facts. So it means that we're essentially making things worse and worse further down the line when we come into policymaking in the future. In essence, hopefully, so I just finished just on time, what do we see happening in the Netherlands? Well, essentially, we basically see that bureaucratic politicization in the Netherlands seems to be more functional than formal or administrative. We can see essentially that because civil servants are being asked to provide more and more political advice, this means that they're being functionally politicized more than in other regards, although there is some research to suggest that there's also more and more formal politicization, which I've put in the reference list, which I can share afterwards. Essentially, what this means is because of these four consequences thereof, so changes in the fabric of the senior civil servant profession, less time for substantive elements, lengthier policy cycles, etc., etc., we see that the quality of policy is endangered, so that the quality of the policies is becoming less and less robust. And we can also see that policies are becoming less effective, so it's not achieving the goals that it sets out to achieve initially. This, of course, is not, unfortunately, a very new development, as we've seen that this was called out particularly after the childcare benefit scandal, the toeslagen affair in the Netherlands, which led to the cabinet calling for what they call a new administrative culture or a new bestuurlijke cultuur. But as you can see by these news headlines which came out just in January, things aren't changing and are in fact getting worse. So you can see that this is not a very, very new development in the Netherlands. It's been around for 10, 15 years, and that despite what the government says, things are only going downhill. So I will leave it for there because I see that it's time, but I want to thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer or clarify any points you may have.